of our mental and physical health. And what I want to emphasize today is that we may have previously, in thinking about social support and how it affects our health and well-being, sort of underappreciated the role that giving support to others might play. So here's the definition, commonly used definition of social support. So this is the perception or experience that one is loved and cared for by others, esteemed and valued, and part of a social network of mutual assistance and obligation. And I have this last part in bold here because I think the mutual assistance and obligation is really important, right? It's not just receiving assistance and having other people be obligated to us. It's also the mutual part, us giving assistance and feeling obligated to other people. But for a long time in the research literature, and I think in sort of everyday life, the assumption has been that social support is beneficial or has benefits for the person who's receiving that support, and is potentially costly for the provider, right? So if you think about, a time where you've had a difficult situation in your life, the assumption is that having a friend or a family member to talk to about that difficult situation is beneficial for you as the receiver, but it's costly for your friend or your family member who's supporting you. And what my colleague Tristan Inagaki has really been arguing over the last few years is that we need to really question this implicit assumption, and that perhaps giving support to other people is actually really good for us. And there's good reason to suspect that this might be true. I again showed you this yesterday, but in one of our most commonly used ways of measuring social support, so this is a survey or a questionnaire that we can give to people to try to get a measure for how much support they perceive they have in their lives, we sort of include this as part of our bigger picture of what social support is. So we have a subscale called Opportunity for Nurturance that has questions like, there are people who call on me to help them. So again, suggesting that this idea of giving support to other people is encompassed within our broader conceptions of what social support is. But we haven't really delved into tackling, is giving actually good for us? If so, why and how? So that's what I'll be talking about today. So some research is starting to address this and is showing that giving social support, providing support to other people, is associated with longevity. So people who report giving more support to others have lower mortality rates over a 5-year period. So these are older adults and they're less likely to die in a 5-year period if they report high levels of support giving. People who report giving more social support to others have fewer sick days from work and school. So they seem to be protected against viruses and bacteria that infect all of us from time to time. And also, they've been shown to, people who give more support to others have been shown to have reduced cardiovascular activity over a 24-hour period. So their hearts are sort of working less hard over 24 hours if they are giving more support to other people. So some initial suggestions that providing or giving social support might be associated with positive health outcomes. But why might this be the case, right? What is it about the act of giving support to other people that could be beneficial to our own health? Well, there are a number of psychological theories that posit that human beings are sort of hardwired to nurture others, to protect others, and to really want to promote the welfare of others. This may be something that's sort of naturalistically present in our brains and bodies, that we have this sort of hardwiring to engage in. And the idea is that this may be rooted in neural or brain and then behavioral systems that originally evolved and came online to help promote the care and protection of offspring. So in the same way that we are sort of evolutionarily prepared to care for offspring and for young, we might, the brain and the body might use those same systems that are in place for helping us care for our offspring more broadly to help us care and provide support to other people. So the idea here is that perhaps giving social support to others could rely on reward mechanisms in the brain. So in the same way that parents and in animal models, they show activation in brain regions important for reward processing in response to caring for young, we might see a similar type of process take place when we're providing support or caring for others. So again, just this idea that the same kind of neural pathways and behavioral pathways that support our ability to care for offspring might be involved in our ability to care for other people. So before I dive into the findings in this area, I wanted to give just some brief background on the reward system in the brain, because this is something that we didn't really talk much about yesterday. So the reward network or the reward system, which is shown primarily by these blue dots here, is made up of the parts of the medial prefrontal cortex. So this means if you cut the brain sort of in half at the hemispheres, it's the part that's kind of just behind your eyes. So shown here. And then the ventral striatum, which I'm going to talk a lot about today, which is more of a kind of primitive brain structure buried more in our subcortical brain, and specifically this kind of subset of the ventral striatum called the nucleus accumbens. Together make up a set of regions that are really responsive to rewarding stimuli. So this includes a variety of different stimuli that could be considered pleasant or rewarding. So in both animal and human models, these regions are active in response to pharmacological drugs and alcohol use, to sex, this is primarily in animal models, to appetitive foods. So think of your favorite food, probably just the mental image that you conjured up in thinking about it is causing your ventral striatum to sort of spike in activity. And some early work in this area wondered, maybe the same system that responds to all these more physical rewards, so drugs, alcohol, sex, good food, would also respond to social rewards. Because again, we know that social relationships are this fundamental need, much like our need for food, water, and shelter. We sort of need to connect with other people. So maybe the brain would be structured in such a way that the same regions that support our intake and desire for physical rewards would also support our intake and desire for social rewards. So let me show you the results of, this is an initial social neuroscience study that investigated this. And basically what they tried to do in this study is examine if the reward pathways in the brain were equally responsive to monetary rewards, so when you win money, as social rewards. In this case, when you sort of win a good reputation. And the idea here is that we're really motivated to maintain a good reputation, right? Most people want to be seen positively in the eyes of other people. So perhaps seeing others' positive impressions of us would be associated with activation in reward-related pathways in the brain. And basically, this might suggest that there is a common neural currency for monetary and social rewards. So that similar brain systems that, again, respond to physical rewards would respond to monetary rewards and then also to social rewards. So to investigate this, these researchers, led by a team led by a fantastic social neuroscientist named Izuma, ran a study. This is, again, a functional MRI study, so where participants are in the MRI scanner and we're tracking where blood is flowing in their brain as an index of the parts of their brain that they're using in response to different types of stimuli. So the participants completed a set of monetary reward trials, meaning basically they had a chance to win a little bit of money on each trial. And if they hit a button fast enough, they would win the money on that trial. If they were too slow, they wouldn't win the money. So a very basic kind of monetary reward task that had been shown in past research to be associated with activity in these reward-related brain regions. So that's the monetary reward trials. They contrasted what was happening in the brain in response to those trials compared to trials where people were winning social rewards. And how they did this is sort of similar to the task that we designed that I told you about yesterday. They told their participants that another set of individuals was going to be looking at a profile, sort of like an online profile, maybe like a Facebook or something like that, that these participants had supposedly made, and giving them feedback about how they came across. So on the social reward trials, what would happen is the participants would see the evaluator, so in this case it's this person, and then they would read a word that the evaluator supposedly used to describe them. So in this case, this is an example of a high social reward where this person is saying, oh, based on your online profile, you seem trustworthy. So pretty nice thing to say about someone, right? It's a socially rewarding experience. They also had some low social reward trials, basically where you have a person saying something still nice about you. Oh, you seem modest, but maybe not quite as nice as you seem trustworthy. And these were all rated in advance by the participants. And then they had no social reward trials where you just saw the picture of the person and some X's. Okay, so what do you think happened? Was there similar amount of activity and reward-related pathways in response to winning money as there was in response to getting social rewards?
So just can I just
Yeah.
So whether the describing words are high or low social reward depends on
Yes, exactly. Yeah, good question. Okay, so what they found was that both social and monetary rewards, so being told nice things about yourself and winning money, are associated with activity in the ventral striatum, this region that is key for underlying our rewarding experiences. So if you look at the red bars here, these are the high monetary reward and high social reward trials. And as you can see, we see a lot more activity in this is the caudate part of the ventral striatum in response to both the high monetary reward and the high social reward. And it sort of drops off as the rewards get less and less. It's kind of interesting to notice that for social rewards, even the low social rewards tend to be associated with pretty high ventral striatum activity, so pretty high reward-related activity versus the low monetary rewards, not so much. So suggesting that sort of even these like moderately nice things that someone might say about you are being processed and encoded by reward-related regions in the brain. So again, just some initial evidence that the reward system in the brain is important for processing social rewards, in addition to monetary rewards and more physical rewards, like food, money, that sort of thing. Or sorry, food and drugs, alcohol. Question? Yeah.
Although so simple, I mean, it can be very complex.
Mm, yeah.
This is one way, I mean, with the brain kind of one thing.
Yeah.
And the other way also a marriage and family therapist,
Mm-hmm.
works slightly very differently, actually. When making a whole
Mm.
in a sense, because that is much more a social giving.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
Like psychologists, although similar, but then a lot of analysis and the third thing would be perception. Perception is I take this as a work,
Mm-hmm.
as a job, versus in the caring professions such as nurse and priest and all those people. And because of that, would there be evidence about they have a longer life?
Mm.
Looking at
Mm.
Mary, Mother Teresa.
Mhm.
When I look at some of this pioneer, like Minochin and all those people, they have.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder, is it a genuine connection, that kind of thing?
Right.
I mean, just guessing, but I think it would be interesting.
Yeah.
Professional way of giving.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think so. Something that I'll talk a little bit about tomorrow is this whole idea of pleasure or hedonia, hedonic rewards, things that feel good, versus eudaimonia or sort of fulfillment and purpose. And perhaps those two types of experiences could be rewarding, right? Could be associated with activity in these regions, but might be differentially related and could predict different outcomes over the long term. So maybe that's where things start to unravel a bit in terms of, the whole idea, like you were saying with addiction, where, you do maybe have diminished activity of these regions in response to the same sort of stimulus versus when it's just for the pursuit of pleasure versus pursuing something for purpose and meaning in life. And then the other thing that I want to emphasize, and I'll circle back to this in a little bit, is that I think we need to be really careful in thinking about how much giving is a good amount of giving. Because we also know that caregiving, sort of the chronic experience of providing care for a spouse with Alzheimer's or dementia or a child with a developmental disability, is associated with poorer health. It's very stressful. So I think, thinking carefully about giving that's on a volunteer basis, where you've sort of elected to do it as opposed to a professional basis, and that doesn't have these additional costs associated with it, is also really important. So yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and the other thing that I'll just say briefly before I move on, I'm not super familiar with this literature, but I know that there's a ton of research on this idea of compassion fatigue. So among people whose professions it is to provide a lot of care and support to others, if you're constantly sort of doing this on a day-to-day basis, it can get fatiguing. And that, hit of reward that you might have gotten initially can sort of diminish over time. So I think there's a lot of nuances that we need to think carefully about there. Absolutely. Yeah, great questions. Okay, so this was receiving support, right? This was someone else saying, or not even support, this is receiving compliments. It's someone else saying, like, oh, you seem like a trustworthy person. What about giving support? Could providing support to someone else be associated with both increases in reward-related processes in the brain, and then also associated with potentially decreases in stress-related processes? Maybe this is part of the mechanism or the way that the brain is helping to contribute to these positive benefits of providing support to others. So we might hypothesize that because we know that caring for offspring in animals increases activity in reward-related regions like the ventral striatum and septal area, that we might see activity in these same regions in response to giving support to other individuals. And that also potentially we might see decreases in stress and threat-related processing regions. So other research in animal models has shown that caring for offspring decreases activation in areas involved in responding to threat, the amygdala that we talked about yesterday. So that is what my colleague Tristan Inagaki hypothesized in this study. And specifically, she was wondering if the neural regions that are important in parental care in animals, like the ventral striatum and the septal area, these reward and caregiving pathways, might be involved in the act of giving support to others in humans. And also if giving support to another person could reduce activity in a brain region, the amygdala, associated with threat and stress. Okay, so I mentioned yesterday that part of the challenge of doing social neuroscience research is that the MRI scanner is a super asocial environment, right? So here's an example of one. We have the person, they're laying on this bed. Ultimately, they're going to get slid into this tiny bore. They have to hold really still. And so the way that Tristan did the study, I thought was quite clever. So she had, these were heterosexual dating couples who'd been together for, I think, a minimum of about a year. And she scanned the female partner while they were either in a number of different conditions, but their male partner was standing outside of the MRI scanner and was supposedly going to be receiving some mild electric shocks. So something that's a little painful, not that bad. They sort of calibrated it before the scan to make sure that the person wasn't like in a ton of pain when they got this shock. So there were 4 different conditions in the study. So in the key condition, the giving support condition, again, the woman is in the scanner, the man is outside the scanner, the man is supposedly going to be shocked, and the woman gets to hold on to his arm. So she's lying in the scanner, he's standing outside, he's supposedly going to get shocked, and she gets to hold on to his arm. So it's a very simple act of giving support, right? Holding someone's hand while they're going through this potentially painful experience. As one control condition, she had a no support condition. So this is when the male partner was supposedly going to receive a shock, but instead of holding on to his arm, she just held on to a squishy ball. So this is an example of a time where your partner could be in distress or going through something negative, but you don't have the opportunity to provide any support to them. In a sort of pure reward condition, what happened here was that there was no threat of shock. So the man is just standing there, life is normal, no shocking is happening, and she gets to hold on to his arm. So just, the pleasant everyday life act of holding a partner's hand. And then in the real pure control condition, there was no shocking happening, and instead of holding on to her partner, the woman is just holding on to this object. Right? And so the really critical condition is this one. Because here, the partner's being shocked, and she has the opportunity to hold his hand, supposedly, with the idea being that maybe she's providing some care or comfort, giving a little bit of support to him during that time. And I think it's super interesting to think about this condition here, right? So this is just the sort of pure reward, love, kindness condition. You're holding someone's hand when life is good. Okay, so what did she find? So first she just looked at people's self-reports. So how connected did they say that they felt to their partner in response to these different conditions? So on the y-axis here we have their self-reported ratings. How connected do you feel to your partner? Not surprisingly, in response to giving support, so when the partner is going to be shocked and the woman gets to hold his hand, we see a strong experience of social connection. The women say they feel fairly connected to their partner. During the no support condition, so this is when he's being shocked and she's just holding onto an object, there's nothing she can do, significant decrease in her perception of feelings of connection to her partner. Similar for the control, so this is where no shocking is happening and she's just holding on to this little squeeze ball, not a lot of feeling of social connection. Okay, I want to do a brief survey before I show you this last bar. Okay, so this is the arm alone condition. No shocking's happening. The partner's just standing out there. Everything's all well and good. And she gets to hold his hand. Where do you think this bar is? Okay, raise your hand if you think it's above the giving support bar. No one. I must have spoiled it. Okay, so raise your hand if you think it's below the support giving bar. Okay, so everyone sort of thinks that this person is going to feel more socially connected to their partner when they're providing them with support, as opposed to when they're just, cuddling on the couch or whatever the analogous condition would be. They're pretty similar, actually. But I think this is surprising. And actually, these are significantly different from each other. So it's fascinating, right? Just being able to potentially provide a little bit of comfort to someone in need is associated with greater feelings of connection to that person, even more so than just baseline hanging out with someone you care about. It's interesting.
Because when I need you, you're there.
Yeah.
So when EFT, they have a term about adult attachment. A woman, when I need you, you are not there. And I think Sue Johnson labeled it as attachment.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think it does make sense, but in some ways I think it's it's interesting that we feel more connected to people when we're sort of caring for them, as opposed to when we're just hanging out in these pleasant conditions. Maybe some of the power of providing support to others. Okay, let's turn to the brain. What happened in these important reward and caregiving related brain regions, the ventral striatum and the septal area, in response to these different conditions? So in response to the giving support, when the partner is being shocked and the woman gets to hold his arm, we see an increase in activity in these regions. We don't see that in response to the no support condition. This makes sense, right? It wouldn't be very nice if you showed reward-related activity to your partner being shocked when there's nothing you can do about it. So not surprising. Similar for the control, we don't see any activity in reward regions when people are, there's no shocking happening, but they're just holding a ball. And then again, with the arm alone condition, we actually see no significant increases in activity in these reward and caregiving pathways. So really providing that little bit of care and support to the partner is associated with greater activation in reward-related regions. Pretty interesting. Okay, final result that I'll tell you about from this study was trying to understand the potential stress buffering pathways here. So might part of the reason why support giving is good for the giver's health not just be through this activation of reward-related brain regions, but also through the ability of those reward regions to sort of down-regulate or dampen activity in threat or stress processing regions. So to look at this, what they did was just looked at the relationship basically between how much activity did you show in these reward regions in response to giving support to your partner, and how did that relate to activation in the amygdala, this key threat and stress processing region. And here's what they found. So for individuals who showed more activity, this is actually the septal area. It's a region that's shown up consistently in animal research involved when animals are caregiving for their young. So people who showed more activity in the septal area in response to providing support to their partners showed lower activity in the amygdala, this key stress and threat processing region. Whereas individuals who showed less activity in the septal area, who didn't maybe experience the same amount of reward or caregiving, activate this caregiving pathway in response to providing support, did not show that same dampening of stress-related neural activity. So suggesting that maybe part of the way that social support giving is good for our health is because it can buffer against our own experiences of stress. And I think that in some ways this makes sense when you're watching a person who you care about go through a negative experience. That can be distressing, right? That can be stressful for you. We have, empathy and our ability to put ourselves in our partners or our friends or our family members' shoes, and we can sort of vicariously experience their threat and stress. But by feeling like we're doing a little bit of something, providing care to them, that can sort of dampen our own stress-related processing. Okay, so this was at least a clue from the brain that maybe part of what support giving is doing is dampening stress. So to take that a step further and to try to really hone in on if that's part of why support giving is good for us, Tristan designed an intervention. So I actually have this for you in your course materials packet. So if you don't mind, let's get those out and turn to page 5. And I give you all the active intervention condition. So you'll see it at the top of the page there. And let's just take a few minutes and actually do it. Maybe we'll experience a lot of reward and it'll dampen our stress from the day or from the week. So go ahead and read the prompt there, and I'll give you just a couple of minutes to do this intervention. Yeah? The reverse? No, not yet. Yeah, that would be really interesting. Yeah.
So it might be a slight.
Yeah, it would be, absolutely, it would be interesting. Okay, just one more minute and we'll move on. Wrap up your letter. Okay, so that was the intervention. You just did it. They had 5 minutes, but she randomly assigned participants who had enrolled in the study. Half of them were randomly assigned, so picked totally at random, not for any particular reason. Roll the dice to this giving support condition, where they were asked to write for 5 minutes a letter to someone in their social network who was in need of some support. She didn't read the letter. They just put it in an envelope. That was it. 5 minutes, write a note. The control condition, they just had to write about, I think it was like their walk to campus or walk to work in the morning. So something totally neutral. Write about it for 5 minutes. What she did was had these individuals in the study get randomly assigned to one of these conditions, intervention or control, giving support or not. And then she put them through the Trier social stress test. So I mentioned this briefly yesterday. It's a very stressful experience that we use in the laboratory to try to induce psychological and physiological stress in individuals. So they come in, we tell them, okay, you have 2 minutes to prepare a speech about why you're a good candidate for your dream job. They quickly get to write down some notes. Then we take the notes away and we say, okay, go into this room. You're going to have this panel of experts who are trained in evaluating verbal and nonverbal behavior. They're going to watch your speech and they're going to be evaluating you. And of course, the evaluators are all dressed up in these nice outfits. They're wearing these lab coats, so they look very official. And the evaluators are taught to be completely neutral throughout the whole task. So none of the nice things that you might do in an interview with someone if you're trying to make them feel good, right? Smiling and nodding and sort of indicating that you're following along. Nope, completely neutral. So it's really stressful for people, both psychologically and physiologically. And we always tell them afterward that, this was not actually real. No one's evaluating them. So they get fully debriefed and everyone's okay when they leave the study. But the intervention happened before that. So either they wrote the note to someone who needed support or wrote the paragraph about their walk to school, and then they went through this stress task. And she measured their negative affect, or sort of how much negative emotions, how stressed, how anxious did they feel before and after. And then she also measured their blood pressure, which is known to increase in response to stress. And then also took some saliva samples from the participants. They had to chew on this little bit of cotton and then spit it into this tube, like you can see there, that allowed her to measure levels of sort of stress hormones, like cortisol, you might have heard of, or the one she focused on here was called salivary alpha amylase, which is a protein that tends to increase in response to stress. It's a marker of sympathetic nervous system activation. And what she was wondering, right, is could the act of writing this supportive note to your friend, of giving support to someone else, buffer you against the negative physiological consequences of stress? So here's what she found, at least for, this is for systolic blood pressure. So blood pressure. The control condition shows what we see over and over again in response to the stress task in the lab. So a significant increase in blood pressure in response to having to give this speech in front of this non-responsive panel of evaluators. The people who'd been in the intervention condition, who were assigned to write this note, a supportive note to a friend or family member, were buffered. So they showed lower increases in systolic blood pressure in response to this stress task. So you still increase a little bit. Everybody does, right? You have to stand up and give this speech. It's sort of going to cause some physiologic arousal in everyone. But individuals in the giving support condition showed less of an increase compared to those in the control condition. Very similar pattern of findings for the saliva samples. So when you look at salivary alpha amylase, this indicator of sympathetic nervous system responses, which are things like epinephrine and norepinephrine, adrenaline, noradrenaline. Individuals who had been assigned to the intervention condition, who wrote the supportive note to a friend, were buffered. They showed less of an increase in levels of salivary alpha amylase, so the red line here, compared to those in the control condition. So I think these are pretty powerful findings. They suggest that the giving side of social support, that giving support to others, may be an underappreciated part of the link between social support and health. And that it's not just getting support when we need it. Certainly that's important. We need to have people around us to support us and comfort us and make us feel a sense of worth, but also the opportunity to provide support to others who we care about is really critical for health and well-being. And these studies illustrate that support giving is part of the mechanism for why this might happen, is that support giving is associated with enhanced reward-related neural activity. So brain systems involved in processing reward, like the ventral striatum, show more activity in response to providing support to others, and are also associated with diminished sympathetic nervous system reactivity to stress. And this is really interesting. It's consistent with research in older adults that's been coming out over the last few years that has been showing that this concept called generativity is related to better health and well-being. So one of my favorite studies in this area, they took a sample of older adults. So these are people mostly retired in the US. Actually, I think this was in Canada, where they're 65 and older, they're sort of at risk for being lonely and socially isolated from others. And they randomly assigned half of them to volunteer at a school. And participate in this reading program where they read to little kids, and the other half were in a control condition. And the older adults who were randomly assigned to this volunteering intervention actually showed better immune system functioning a few months later than those in the control condition. And this was a super win-win, right? Because not only are the older adults who are doing the volunteering experiencing these health benefits, but these kids get these, older, wise individuals helping them with their reading. So another example of how giving and providing support to other people can be important for health and well-being. So I have some questions for discussion and reflection that we can delve into, but I just want to encourage all of us to think about ways that we can give more support to others or talk to other people about the benefits of giving support. But again, as we talked a little bit about earlier, I think it is also really important to recognize that there's a threshold after which support giving can go from beneficial to the giver to sort of more burdensome or more taxing, like people who are in chronic caregiving roles, like caregiving for spouses with dementia are often studied, or parents who are caring for kids with developmental disabilities. This can become a form of chronic stress. So it's not as though necessarily more support giving is always going to necessarily be good. And I think we should think carefully about sort of how much is the right amount for each individual. And then, Tristan has identified reward pathways and stress buffering pathways as potential mechanisms by which support giving might be good for health, but there could be others. And so I think that's another super interesting thing to think about. But again, I've just been blown away watching this line of research develop, and I think it's really changed the way that the field is thinking about the benefits of social support, that it's not just for the receiver, but it's also for the giver. Any thoughts before we move on? Yeah.
Has there been any case studies along those lines? Because I imagine even if someone is not in like a the task you have in a laboratory, no matter how creative it can be, it's still
Sure.
so. And also, a mild electric shock. I wouldn't imagine my partner actually being harmed in an experiment. But if in a real life situation, I imagine I'm giving support to someone, it might be.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it might be interesting to see.
Yeah.
How that would fluctuate or how.
Absolutely. And yes, there's a ton of research, not just case studies, but quantitative research suggesting exactly what you were talking about, that more serious real world chronic, I think the chronicity piece is really, really key. So, if you have a partner, I've been thinking about this a little bit for a grant in the context of cancer, where if you have a partner has a cancer diagnosis and you're, helping them deal with the idea of their own mortality and accompanying them to treatments and sort of watching them go through this really stressful experience, then that can have a whole host of negative effects on your health. So absolutely, and I completely agree. And there's a really strong evidence base to suggest that is the case. So again, I think the boundaries and thinking about sort of when things go from being this kind of positive boost of I feel like I'm providing for a person or for the world, and I'm sort of being rewarded, and that helps me see beyond my own troubles and my own, stressors, that can be good. But the more chronic experiences can become stressors for sure. For sure. It's a great point. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 True. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But again, I see
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, is all this personality,
Right.
how much is much, and
Yeah.
financial burden,
Right.
and all the combination of that.
Yeah. The threshold for how much is too much could certainly vary based on the situation or the person and their personality. Absolutely. Okay. I want to move on to talk. I'm going to talk about this just briefly, but I think it's intriguing. So I wanted to present it to you all and actually hear what you think. And I was thinking maybe we could develop some sort of collaboration to try to test some of these things in Hong Kong, because I think it would be interesting to think about the cultural effects. So here I'm going to talk about expressive writing interventions and the neural bases of affect labeling and how labeling our emotions might contribute to positive well-being and health. Okay, so expressive writing research was really pioneered by this brilliant social psychologist, Jamie Pennebaker. He's a distinguished professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And his idea, it started relatively simply. So what if just writing about our stressful, traumatic experiences could be therapeutic? So the way that this started for him was with this question of, is secret keeping, sort of suppressing and keeping to yourself information about a traumatic experience that you might have had, basically a form of active inhibition that uses up our cognitive resources. So if we're sort of carrying around the burden of a traumatic experience, might the consequences of keeping that inside and not expressing it sort of take up our mental bandwidth so that we can't use those cognitive resources in other settings? If this was true, then maybe just the act of writing down our secrets or our traumatic experiences could sort of free up those resources that we were using before to try to inhibit talking about those things and make us healthier and happier. That was the idea. Relatively simple, but I think profound idea. If you like this stuff, you should, I'm not getting paid to say this or anything, but you should check out Jamie Pennebaker's book called Opening Up by Writing It Down. Super interesting idea. Okay, so tons of research. There have now been meta-analyses, studies of studies, that have shown that individuals who are randomly assigned to write about their traumatic experiences for 15 to 20 minutes for 3 to 5 consecutive days show, in follow-up periods, fewer visits to the doctor, better functioning of the immune system, lower levels of stress hormones like cortisol, and improved mental health, lower depressive and anxiety symptoms. So just writing about traumatic experiences that aren't shown to anyone, it's sort of a one-way street. It's just writing down about what had happened, seemed to be beneficial for physical and mental health. Since these initial studies showing the positive benefits of expressive writing, Jamie Pennebaker has done a ton of work trying to figure out what is it about the writing, what are there sort of individual differences in the magnitude of the benefit of this type of intervention. And he has another book that's called The Secret Life of Pronouns that's also really interesting, that talks about how people who really seem to benefit from these expressive writing interventions are the ones who change in their pronoun use over the course of their writing session. So they sort of suggest that something about the way that they're thinking about the self in relation to what happened to them is what's important for predicting recovery. So again, another cool book of his that you can check out if you want. But how does this work neurally? How does this work biologically? What are the potential neural mechanisms that might underlie these benefits? What's happening in the brain when we are doing this expressive writing, when we're divulging our secrets onto the page that's promoting our health? So a former mentor of mine at UCLA, Matt Lieberman, had this interesting hypothesis, which is that perhaps just labeling our affect, labeling our emotions, putting our feelings into words might have the power to reduce the emotional experience itself. So I kind of think of this like an ouch for other emotional states. Like, there's research that shows if you stub your toe and you say ouch, or a much less, a much worse word, or a few less worse or less good words, that it diminishes the pain. Something about labeling that experience seems to take away some of the impact. And the idea here was that maybe this is some sort of implicit emotion regulation strategy. So emotion regulation has been this super hot topic in psychology over the past couple of decades. This idea of how do we, when we're having an emotional experience, how do we dampen it if we want to, or amplify it if we want to. So if I, get in a fight with my mom and I don't want to fight with her and I don't want to feel negative, how do I change the way that I'm thinking about the situation to make me feel better? So that's typically thought of as this very active process, right? It's something about me changing my cognitions about the situation to make myself feel better. Maybe just labeling my emotions, putting my feelings into words, might act as sort of a more implicit emotion regulation strategy that could cause, disrupt the emotional experience itself. So if this is the case, then we might hypothesize that labeling our affect could disrupt our amygdala reactivity to negative emotions. Again, amygdala is this key region involved in processing threat and stress and salience. So if labeling our emotions is this sort of implicit emotion regulation strategy, then maybe labeling them could diminish activity in the amygdala. And it might do this by engaging regions of prefrontal cortex that help us control our thoughts and behavior. So the same regions that are important when we're doing this more effortful type of emotion regulation, where we're changing the way that we're thinking about something, maybe those same brain regions might be engaged just during the act of labeling, and that could down-regulate our amygdala activity. Okay, so that's what they set out to test. They did this in 30 healthy young adults. And they scanned them again using fMRI while they went through a number of different conditions. So the key one here is this affect label condition. So what happened is participants would see a picture of a face at the top of the screen, and they would be asked to label what emotion this person is feeling. So is this woman scared or angry? Press a button, with one finger if it's the emotion on the left, press a button with the other finger if it's emotion on the right. So putting this feeling, this affect into words, labeling it. And they looked at what was happening in the brain in response to this affect labeling condition in comparison to a number of other different conditions. So things like matching the affect. So rather than saying a label for what this person is feeling, which of these people is feeling the same thing as him? Press one button if it's the person on the left, another button if it's the person on the right. Just simply observe. Just look at the face and take it in. Label the gender of the person pictured. So is this a female named Helen or a male named Samuel? So this controls for the act of labeling, right? Here they're labeling something. They're just labeling the gender, not the affect. Matching the gender, which one is the same gender as the person at the top, and then matching shapes. So super comprehensive. We have all these lovely control conditions to try to control for every possible thing that could be varying. And what we really cared about, right, is what happens in response to the affect label when we're putting this feeling into words. So what they found was that indeed labeling the emotion did disrupt activity in the amygdala. So here's the region of the amygdala that they looked at here. And what you can see from this graph is that amygdala activation is the lowest when participants are labeling the affect on the face. So when they're saying, oh, this person looks afraid. And it's significantly lower than all of the rest of the conditions. It's not just the act of labeling, right? Because you don't see the same disruption. You don't see the same lowering of amygdala activity in response to labeling the gender. Okay, so interesting. Maybe this is one of the ways in which expressive writing has its positive benefits. It's sort of labeling the emotion and disrupting that affective experience. They also found that the affect labeling condition was associated with greater right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex activity. That's a mouthful. You can say RVLPFC for short. As a shorthand, you can think of this as an important region that helps us sort of control our behavior. So control if we press a button or not, control if we label the color a word is written in versus the color word in like a Stroop task. Here it seems to activate more in response to the affect labeling. And interestingly, this is also a region that comes online during more effortful forms of emotion regulation. So like if I showed you the picture of the angry face and I said, tell yourself a story to make this seem less negative. So that's a much more active process, right? You might think, oh, this person is just an actor in a film and she's not actually scared or there's not actually a threat out in the environment. This is just the act of labeling activates the same region. And interestingly, the extent to which people show greater activity in this lateral prefrontal region that helps us control our behavior and our thoughts, people who show more activity there show less activity in the amygdala. So it seems like this is the region that might be sort of helping to diminish activity in this threat or stress-related processing region. Okay, so what do we conclude from this? Well, I think the first and foremost take-home message is that expressive writing, writing down information about our traumatic experiences can be beneficial. Maybe part of the reason why it's beneficial is because labeling our emotions, putting our feelings into words, seems to act a bit like an implicit way of regulating or altering our emotions. So the act of labeling emotions engages the same prefrontal regions that are involved in other types of behavioral and cognitive regulation of emotions that are much more effortful than just labeling. And the extent to which individuals engage this prefrontal cortex region during labeling seems to dampen activity in the amygdala, sort of removing that affective potency of the image. So this could potentially be one of the neural mechanisms through which expressive writing has its powerful benefits on health and well-being. Question? Yeah?
Just wondering if perhaps simply by validating our own emotions,
Mm-hmm.
I guess sometimes people, if they're experiencing a lot of emotions, they might have trouble putting it into words or actually admitting that they feel sad or angry or something. So if that is the case, then maybe just about, okay, I am feeling sad.
Right.
I have the same effect.
Yeah, potentially, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's clearly tons of other ways in which communicating about stress and trauma can be effective. It could be, within the self. It could be with a support figure or a therapist or whatever. I think what's interesting about the writing is just, it suggests that for some individuals, you might not need all of that. It could just be the act of writing it down. And maybe what writing is sort of forcing people to do is to face those experiences and put their feelings into words. Absolutely. I mean, I think this affect labeling idea is promising. I think clearly there's a difference between seeing a random person's angry face and saying that person seems angry, and, you know, discussing or processing or thinking about or writing about your own, you know, terrible traumatic experiences. Those are two ends of the emotional spectrum, clearly, in terms of magnitude. But it's at least a window into what could possibly be happening. And we can, with that evidence base, right, this is the whole idea of this course, with the evidence base about how the brain is processing these experiences of affect labeling, we can, you know, try and move forward and study this in more sophisticated ways with that knowledge. That's the idea. Yeah.
Neurologically, the process is totally emotion.
I think you can.
Is how I think about the language. So basically, and it's dampen the emotion,
Right.
so that you can be.
Yeah.
The labeling is a process. So clinically, we all why CBT work? Because you down the irrational emotion. That's the label.
Right.
When you totally lost, and using the same kind of thinking is, I guess, when you need a client to write things down, to say write, because they will come back and say I cannot write because I've been so thinking angry emotion at the time. So the processes is basically shifting one to the frontal loop. In a sense.
Yeah. Bringing online those prefrontal regions for sure is critical. I mean, I think the other thing that's interesting about the expressive writing is that, and I'm sure in his book he goes into all of this, but it's not just doing it once, right? It was like consecutive days of writing about the same experience that you had, and how doing that multiple times, maybe the initial writing is very affect laden and very emotional and very negative, but then, you know, over time, by putting it into words and thinking about it in a different way, it changes. The story you tell yourself about what happened changes. Yeah. Bess, did you have a question? Yeah.
So based on the findings, you suggest that maybe that the neural mechanisms is through the amygdala and also the RVFC, right? So I just wonder, is the labeling someone else's affects equivalent to
your own
expressive writing? And also, like, so that is the common, like, different processes going on, writing it down and labeling, and then and also the so writing expressing your own emotions is your own emotions,
right?
And labeling in this task is labeling someone else's,
right?
So I'm just thinking, like, whether you could. What was your comment?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it was a critique that I had myself of this work for a long time. So they've now done studies where it is more labeling your own emotions as opposed to the image that you see there. I mean, I think the extent to which writing is critical can't be answered here, and having someone write in an MRI scanner is pretty much impossible unless you had a complicated, camera setup or something. But yeah, it's certainly with EEG. I don't know of any work that has looked at that, but that would make it much easier. Absolutely, yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, yeah. No, thank you. I was gonna give you a brief break. Are people feeling okay? Sounds good. So let's come back in 4 or 5 minutes, and we'll go through the last part of the talk. And I'm happy to answer questions if people have them. 20, 25 minutes or so. So in the last part of my talk today, I want to talk about some really interesting new work looking at self-affirmation interventions and how the act of affirming important values might be represented in the brain and might be translated into changes in health. Okay, so to start off with, what is self-affirmation? So self-affirmation is an intervention or a technique that's actually been around for a few decades, and it's based on this idea that people are motivated to maintain a positive global conception of self, right? Everyone wants to feel good about themselves. So the question becomes, what do we do when we're faced with information that threatens our positive self-concept? So what do we do if I generally want to have a good sense of myself, that I'm a good person, a positive person, a person of worth, and all of a sudden someone comes along and gives me some information that might threaten that self-concept. So let's say I should probably exercise more. And I go to my doctor, and my doctor says, you know what, Keely, you really need to exercise more. I, don't want to feel bad about myself. I don't want to feel like I'm lazy and sedentary and overweight. And so maybe one of the ways that I respond to that information, that suggestion from my doctor, is to get defensive, right? And I say, oh, actually, I do work out a little bit and it's probably fine. Or, I'm still young, I'll worry about exercise later in my life. Or I just totally ignore the information from my doctor. I just say, oh, my doctor is a terrible doctor. I'm going to switch doctors. We don't want people to do this, right? We need people to encode messages about health and well-being that is important for promoting their health and well-being, even though it might feel kind of crummy in the moment to get that feedback. So how do we get people to be more receptive to information that might be threatening to them in the moment, but important for them in the long run? That's the idea of self-affirmation. It was an intervention technique sort of designed to deal with these types of situations. So how do we self-affirm? How do we make people go through this process of affirming important things about themselves to try to make them less defensive in the face of potentially threatening information? So many different techniques have been used in the self-affirmation literature. Most common, and the one that I'm going to focus on today, is values affirmation, getting people to reflect on their important values. Other ways is we could remind people of their accomplishments and their strengths. Like, yeah, maybe I should work out more, but I studied really hard in school and did well. So reminding someone of their accomplishments or their strengths before giving them this potentially threatening information. Giving them positive feedback, potentially in a different domain. Or in the same domain. Maybe my doctor says, your cholesterol is nice and low, you're doing a good job with your diet, but you need to work out more, right? So some positive feedback before that threatening information. Or people can even do this spontaneously. I'll tell you a brief personal anecdote, which is before I had heard about this research, and actually since, I noticed early in grad school when I was going to give presentations, I would get nervous. Everyone does, I think, when you're public speaking, and especially early on when I didn't have a lot of confidence, didn't feel like I knew very much. And I would often sort of find myself thinking before I would give a presentation, well, you know what? no matter what, my mom's gonna love me. Even if I totally blow this and I don't do a good job, I know that my mom will still love me and care about me and think that I'm a good person. So this sort of spontaneous way that I affirmed this relationship that I have with my mom. So these are some of the ways that people have studied self-affirmation, but values affirmation is most common in the literature now, and it's what we focused on in our own work. So what is values affirmation? It's basically giving people a list of potentially important values and just having them rank them according to whatever is important to them. Which of these they choose isn't important. What's important is that we have people rank them. Most often out of this particular list here, on average, people choose relations with friends and family as their most important value, but certainly, other people might value, religious values. Other people might really value art or athletics. So there's certainly variability, but on average, most people choose relations with friends or family. Okay, so in pages 6 and 7 in your course materials, I actually gave you the values affirmation task. So for the sake of time, maybe we won't do it all right now, but you can see the list of values there. And if you are a participant in a self-affirmation intervention study, you would go through, you would rank those different values, and then you would be randomly assigned to one of two conditions. Either, if you're in the active intervention condition, you would be asked to write about your top ranked value and why it's important to you. So for me, if that's friends and family, I would be asked to think about my relationships with my friends and family and reflect on and write about why they're important to me. If I'm in the control condition of the intervention, then I write about the least important value and why it might be important to someone else. So, for me, maybe I don't really value athletics. Let's stick with my I should work out more example and say, I'd be asked to write about, if I'm in the control condition, why athletics is really important to someone else. So you're welcome to use this and to take an opportunity to do it when you get home later if you want. This seems, again, really simple and straightforward, but it's also super powerful. So in studies where people have engaged in self-affirmation, affirmed their important values, research has shown that they show reduced negative educational outcomes. So reduced negative educational outcomes in the classroom of chronic stress. So we know chronic stress can lead to poor educational outcomes. Affirming the self can diminish that. Reduced experiences of stereotype threat and discrimination. And reduced identity threat and feelings of poor academic fit. So reminding people about their values and what's important to them can lead to beneficial educational outcomes in these different contexts. Self-affirming before stress can also reduce physiological stress responses. So this has been shown both with cortisol, that stress hormone I've mentioned a couple of times now, and with epinephrine. So again, I guess this is sort of what I was spontaneously doing before I was giving my talks. I'm about to go through a stressor. I remind myself of this important value, this relationship that I have with my mom, and that can reduce my physiological responses to stress. And I think this one is super critical and important, and I'll go through a study that looked at this in a second. But self-affirmation before receiving health messages has also been shown to be linked with reduced defensiveness, which leads to improvements in health behaviors. So again, you can imagine a smoker who's being faced with some public service announcement or a discussion with their doctor about the negative effects of cigarette smoking. For individuals who had an opportunity to affirm their important values before they received those messages, they were less defensive and more likely to diminish their smoking behavior compared to individuals who did not go through that self-affirmation. So I think pretty compelling. Again, there's a ton of research in this area, so I'm just giving you a few highlights here. So self-affirmation has also been associated with improved recovery after social exclusion. Interestingly, an increased focus on others and more pro-social behavior, including helping others and seeking out health information on behalf of others. So affirming important values can lead people to be more other-focused and more pro-social. And this was an interesting recent study where it also made people more open to opposing political views, sort of more accepting of people who think differently from them. And we'll talk a lot about this tomorrow, but self-affirmation has also been associated with increased eudaimonic well-being, or the experience of feeling that life is meaningful and purposeful. Some important caveats. One is that affirming important values often only helps when you're in a vulnerable state. So it's not necessarily true that just like walking around affirming your values all the time is going to lead you to the good life. But during times of high stress, or for individuals who might sort of chronically feel stereotyped or excluded, this act of self-affirming seems to be particularly beneficial. Also, I kind of ruined it for you all because it turns out that awareness of the benefits of self-affirmation also makes it less effective. Not entirely. It doesn't totally diminish these effects. But if I tell you that, hey, I want you to think about, something that's really important to you right now, and then I tell you, oh, and this is going to, make you less defensive or make you less stressed, that seems to take away some of the power of the intervention. Okay, so how does this work? What are the psychological mechanisms that might lead self-affirmation to all of these positive benefits that we see? So there's a whole host of mechanisms that have been demonstrated. So it appears that part of what self-affirmation is doing is broadening the focus beyond the self, sort of opening us up to other experiences and other ideas, that it's freeing up our psychological or cognitive resources and enhances our feelings of social connection to others. And we've talked a lot about how good that is. And interestingly, it actually might get people to pay more attention to threat in a good way, right? So I mentioned at the beginning, if I'm being told by a doctor that I need to exercise more, a natural, and I hate exercise and I don't do it very much, a natural tendency for me would be to ignore it and feel like, oh, this is not actually a threat to me. I don't actually need to be physically active. So the fact that self-affirming gets people to pay more attention to threatening health messages is actually really critical. So there's been a lot of work on this, but of course, self-affirmation has these biological effects, right? It leads to lower levels of epinephrine, lower levels of cortisol. How is it affecting biology? What might be the neural pathways that are contributing to the benefits of self-affirmation? So part of what we posited in some of our work is that similar to giving support to others, that self-affirmation might engage neural systems involved in reward. So this is consistent with other work that's shown that thinking about the self as you might be doing when you're affirming your important values, recalling positive autobiographical memories, so positive experiences from your past, thinking about your social connections. All of these things are associated with greater reward activity. And these are all psychological processes that individuals might go through when they're engaging in self-affirmation. So potentially, reward is part of the neural mechanism. Maybe part of what's happening when people self-affirm is it's engaging reward circuitry. And research has shown that engagement of reward circuitry, like the ventral striatum, can lead to biological stress reduction. So rats receiving sweet liquids, which, as I mentioned previously, is associated with activation of reward pathways, show diminished stress reactivity. And given that reward regions in the brain have these inhibitory connections to threat and stress processing regions, maybe part of what's happening is that activation of the reward system during affirmation is leading to these positive benefits. Okay, so we tested this in a paper in 2016 in 2 different fMRI studies. The studies are fairly similar and the results are consistent, so I'll go through them rather quickly. But in study 1, we investigated if self-affirmation, affirming important values, leads to reward-related activation in the brain. And then we replicated this same type of idea in a community adult population. The first study was with college students. Okay, so we brought 38 undergraduates into the lab, and we asked this fairly simple question, which is, does thinking about important personal values, or the act of self-affirming, lead to increased reward-related neural activity, and specifically greater activity in the ventral striatum? So this is somewhat repetitive, but again, we were just trying to understand if reflecting on your important values leads to greater reward activity, specifically in the ventral striatum, and if that could be part of what is contributing to the positive benefits of affirmation. Okay, so here's what participants would do in the scanner. So we would select one of their top values and pair it with one of their less important values. So let's say maybe social issues are really important to me, politics less important. So I would see these 2 images depicting these values on the screen, and then I would just be asked to indicate which of these pictures or which of these values do I prefer, which is most important to me. So really simple, straightforward. Think about which of these is most important and indicate your preference. To design a control task where people were still thinking about features of items and deciding what might be important to them, we had them evaluate toasters. So very different from your important values, right? But they still see 2 different toasters, and they have to indicate which of them they prefer, the one based on color or the one based on capacity. So controlling for viewing images of things, making a decision about preference, evaluating an object, but clearly much less impactful than thinking about and reflecting on important values. Okay, so what did we find? We found basically what we hypothesized, that reflecting on important values is associated with greater activity in reward-related brain regions, specifically the ventral striatum. So our self-affirmation trials where participants were choosing their important values were associated with greater activity in the ventral striatum compared to the non-affirmation trials when they're making decisions about toasters. So it seems like thinking about important values leads to greater reward-related brain activity compared to thinking about lower-ranked values and compared to thinking about toasters. So engaging in the self-affirmation task led to greater reward activity than the non-affirmation task. And this was some initial evidence that one of the ways in which self-affirmation may operate at a neural level and confer its health benefits is via activation of reward pathways, which can dampen physiological responses to stress. We tested a similar idea in another sample. So this was 21 community adult women, so a slightly older sample. And we had them do a similar task, but this time instead of seeing images, they just saw descriptions of different values. So they might see a screen like this where we have spontaneity on one side and creativity on the other, and they have to choose which of these values do they prefer, what's most important to them. And just like in our first study, we again found that there was greater activation in the ventral striatum, this key reward pathway, in response to thinking about important values compared to less important values. Okay, so to quickly sum up these studies, we found that self-affirmation leads to greater ventral striatum activity. This doesn't seem to be about specific values or specific images, but really generalizes and replicates in a couple of paradigms. So maybe reward is one mechanism for self-affirmation's many benefits. Maybe part of the reason why affirming the self and thinking about values is protective is because it causes activation in reward pathways. So this research really focused on what's happening in the brain during self-affirmation, right? During the act of thinking about your important values. What about how self-affirmation changes the brain? How does thinking about your important values change the way that you respond to a subsequent task? Specifically, in this case, we looked at health messages. So this is a paper from a few years ago by my former lab mate, Emily Falk, and one of my former mentors, Matt Lieberman, where they were really building on this idea that I mentioned at the beginning, that health messages can be threatening. So if we have in the US, we'd call them a couch potato, someone who's very sedentary, who doesn't exercise very much, which we know is not very good for you mentally or physically in the long run. And the couch potato sees a message like this, either a public health campaign, a commercial while they're watching TV, or an ad in the subway, or they have a conversation with their doctor about how physical activity is really important. This couch potato is likely going to experience this information as pretty threatening, right? Because it suggests that they're not a very good person because they don't do this, and people want to maintain this positive sense of self. So what the couch potato might do is exactly what I mentioned at the beginning, just get defensive, or totally ignore the information, say, oh, this isn't relevant to me, or, I'll worry about this later. We don't want this. We want people to take in the important messages that we have for them about how to improve health and well-being. So how do we get them to do that? So in this study, they tested this idea that maybe another way in which self-affirmation works is by making health messages seem more self-relevant. So rather than this being a problem for someone else or a problem for the me in the future, all of a sudden I see it as more relevant to me and potentially as more valuable. Like the information itself is more value. It's more relevant to me, it's more valuable. That process is often represented by activation in brain regions that are important for values and self-referencing. In this case, they looked at the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And perhaps that activation in VMPFC during processing of health information could predict increases in positive health behaviors. Okay, so that's exactly what they studied here. So they brought a bunch of fairly sedentary adults who reported very low levels of physical activity into the lab. They had them wear an accelerometer, which basically, you can think of it as like a fancy Fitbit or a fancy sort of step counter. They had them wear this accelerometer for a week just to get a baseline of how little physical activity they did. Then they randomly assigned them to either affirm their important values, to engage in self-affirmation, or a control task. and they scanned them, again using fMRI, while they processed health messages about physical activity. So now instead of focusing on what's happening in the brain during affirmation, they're focusing on what's happening in the brain when people are viewing these health messages that could be threatening, or not if you're self-affirmed. After the scan and after that values affirmation intervention, they wore the accelerometer for another 4 weeks so they could look at change. So how much did people increase in their physical activity? They also got some text message reminders of their values if they were in the active intervention condition. And then they measured physical activity for a month after the intervention. So again, accelerometer is basically a fancy Fitbit that tells them how much physical activity people are engaged in. Very similar to the task that I mentioned and that I've given you in your course materials, participants were asked to rank their important values, and then people in the affirmation intervention condition were asked to reflect upon and think about their top ranked value. Those in the control condition thought about their bottom ranked value. And then they were scanned using fMRI, where they were processing a number of different health messages. So all these messages were focused on promoting physical activity, emphasizing the risk that they might be under for not being physically active, reasons to not be sedentary, reasons to be more active, how to be more active. So all the types of messages that you might get if you were, having a conversation with a doctor about physical activity. So this is what the task looked like. So they would see something describing, say, their risk. So people who sit less are at lower risk for certain diseases. So promoting physical activity. They were asked to think about why they should increase their physical activity or decrease their sedentary behavior and how they might do that. And then they were asked to, sort of customize it for their own lives. Think about how you would actually put this into practice in your own life. They measured neural responses during this task. As an additional piece of the intervention, they got these text message reminders for each day throughout the 1 month follow-up. In both the active intervention and the control condition, they received these reminders. They just varied in their content. So for the affirmation condition, they got reminded of their important values. For the control condition, they were not. And they had 45 participants who completed this whole study, which is pretty impressive for an fMRI study. Here's what they found. So they found that there was greater VMPFC activity, this region that's important for processing self-relevance and value, among individuals who were in the self-affirmation condition compared to the control condition when they were processing these health messages. So those who had thought about or reflected upon their important values showed greater activity in this region that's critical for thinking about the self and thinking about things that are valuable when they were getting health messages. People in the affirmation condition who had affirmed their important values showed a decrease in sedentary behavior over the 1 month following the intervention. So an increase in the amount of physical activity that they engaged in. So this is really impressive. This very brief opportunity to reflect on important values led to a decrease in sedentary behavior among these individuals who had previously been couch potatoes. And then finally, they found that individuals with the greatest levels of VMPFC activity during the task, so among people in the intervention condition, among those in the self-affirmation condition, those who showed greater VMPFC activity when they were processing these health messages. So these are the folks here, showed an increase or sorry, those are these people. They show basically lower levels of sedentary behavior in the month following the scan. Okay, so it seems like reflecting on important values leads to higher VMPFC, critical region involved in thinking about the self and processing value when seeing health messages. And this results in a decrease in sedentary behavior. They hypothesize in the study that this probably occurs by dampening threat, but they sort of can't quite test that in this particular paradigm. But it seems like VMPFC activity is one of the key mechanisms that might link self-affirmation with positive health benefits. So what I take away from this is that to the extent that we can make individuals feel affirmed or more kind of secure in their self and their self-worth by reminding them of their important values, we can make messages that might be threatening or feel like things we want to ignore and not see as relevant to us, more relevant, more self-relevant, be perceived as more valuable. And that can lead us to really process those messages, internalize those messages, and change our behavior in positive ways. So it's a pretty powerful and interesting line of work about, affirming important values, having these benefits. So we're about out of time. Do people have thoughts or reflections about self-affirmation? Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that I agree with what people see that. And sometimes working with Chinese learning from a cultural perspective is the Chinese tend to have difficulties sometimes learning that I'm good at this.
Yeah.
There is a whole culture of you should not be bragging about yourself.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
need to be modest.
Yeah.
So when that trigger this thing, then the next thing is, right?
Yeah.
That turns into a very confusing.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is all.
I wonder how that.
Yeah.
Because I see all your.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think this would be super interesting to try to replicate in another sample.
Sometimes not all self-doubting.
Yeah.
Themselves.
Yeah.
Even just standing up and say something.
Yeah.
They feel
Yeah.
class student is all.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, we should do that. Yeah. I'm happy to stick around and answer individual questions if people have them. But thank you again for coming. I hope this was useful and interesting, and I hope to see you all in the morning for the last of our sessions. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Alex. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
As Keely mentioned, tomorrow we'll have the last section for this travel. And then if you cannot make it for tomorrow's sessions, you can fill out the evaluation form. And then if you come back again tomorrow morning, you can make your opinions and your feedbacks are very important for us. And also on the back of the evaluation form, there is a schedule. I think we'll have another 3-day short course in middle of July, and then we'll have 2 more seminars on the end of September and early October. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think some of your questions and reflections are very good as well. I think there are a lot of room for further exploring these topics and inventions. So the key message, providing social support, and then expressive our emotions, writing, and then also the values, important self-affirmation of important values, maybe important well-being and our health. So maybe we can keep reflecting tonight, and then if you have more questions for tomorrow, and then you can ask Keely.
Yeah.
You can share. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Watch.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. No, this is good. Yeah. I feel like people are committed.